Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video about documentation. In this video, we're going to start off by taking a look at why documentation is so important to the upkeep of a network. And after we talk about why we want to have it, well, we'll take a look at what we should have. And then we'll get right down to some specific pieces of documentation like wiring schematics, physical and logical network diagrams, baselines, which are used with network performance, network policies, procedures, and configurations, and finally, we'll take a look at what regulations are. So, why is documentation so important? And I'll tell you what, I really need to emphasize the point that documentation is important. And yes, it is worth doing. And I know that that's easier said than done. I know that as a network administrator, you're extremely busy and you have many other responsibilities. And you know, the documentation of things just tends to just kind of fall to the bottom of your priority list. And I'm here to tell you that you should bump it up in the list, at least just a little bit, because there are many different reasons that documentation can come in real handy. Now, a few that I have as examples for you is I have training. It's easier to train new administrators when you have good documentation available for them so that they can use it to familiarize themselves with the current network environment. Now, that's actually only one aspect of having good documentation for training purposes. I mean, we could talk about just having good training documentation. In other words, having good procedures in place as to how we're going to train new administrators. What do we need to train new administrators with? But then you also have the aspect of having new administrators who are more easily trained if they have documentation available. Well, then you don't have to explain every little nook and cranny about the network. They can get it from the documentation. How about troubleshooting? Let me tell you something. Most problems occur more than once. And it's easier to reference documentation than to go through all the same troubleshooting procedures again and again and again for the same problem. And here's the funny part. You know, typically the way we think of this is we think of it as one person comes across a problem on the network. That person takes the time to troubleshoot the problem, finds out what caused it, and finds an appropriate solution. If that person documents all of that information, then the next person, whether it be a newer administrator or maybe just a peer, right? There's maybe more than one administrator out running the network. When another person comes across the same problem, well, if they can just reference what we sometimes like to refer to as a knowledge base of information about past problems and the symptoms and the causes and the resolutions, they can then solve the problem a lot faster than you did the first time around. And they don't have to go through all the step-by-step troubleshooting procedures. Now, that may be the way we typically think of it, but here's the funny thing. And I can tell you from first-hand experience that this does happen. Sometimes the exact same administrator will run into the exact same problem, but they'll forget what they did the first time around. I can tell you that there are many times that I have come across a problem, or maybe somebody presented a problem to me and I said, oh yeah, I had that happen. Here's what I did. Oh, wait a minute, what did I do? If it was documented, well, then I could just go back and say, you know, let me look up what I did. No problem. And here's the real funny thing. The more difficult the problem is to resolve, the more likely you have this belief that you'll never forget it. Right? You'll have this really massive problem and then you finally bust through and solve it and you say to yourself, man, whew, I feel good. I finally tackled that issue. But boy, was that a doozy. And as a matter of fact, I will never forget that as long as I live. Wow. Right? And so what do? You don't document it. You just skip that step. And what happens? It almost never fails. Some point in the future, usually right about, you know, just a hair past the span that your memory is able to hold on to what you did, it happens again. And you say to yourself, oh yeah, I had this happen before. I know what to do. And then what do you find yourself doing? You find yourself going through the exact same procedures. You have this feeling of deja vu. You say, oh, I know what I did. And you go out there and you say, I know I Google searched it and then I found the answer and it was this article. And so you go and you put in that same Google search. And what you really did was you put in the same Google search that maybe you tried the first time that wasn't the right answer. So anyway, I'm kind of rambling on here, but I really need to emphasize the point here. And that is, especially when it comes to troubleshooting, you got to have good documentation to help you solve the problems, whether it be documentation about the layout of your network or whether it be documentation about past problems like a knowledge base. Now, another reason I have here is reporting. Now, reporting has many different meanings. What I have here is I say that it's easier to justify your work and solidify your purpose when you have good documentation to give to your superiors. So if you're being challenged, maybe you're up for a review and you have upper management asking, well, what is it that you computer guys do anyway? Well, having good documentation that lays out in detail how the network is designed and all the different policies, procedures, everything that's been taking place, having that all put together will help upper management to understand what you computer guys are doing. Now, another aspect of reporting might be if somebody were to come into the network. Maybe you hire a consultant, and that consultant needs to know things about your network. Well, again, if you have good documentation, you can easily report to them how things have been done. Especially, and just to relate this back to troubleshooting a little bit, what if you've hired this consultant to come in and help you solve a problem that you've been unable to tackle all on your own? Well, the better your documentation, the better chance that that consultant's going to be able to help you find that problem, or at least help you find it in a timely manner before you spend too much money. So as you can see, documentation is extremely important, even though we tend to make it the bottom of our list because nobody likes to do it. It's a very tedious task, and we have so many other responsibilities. But see if you can't bump it up a few notches on your to-do list. Alright, so now that we know why, well, what should I document? Well, there's an easy answer to this one. Everything. If you're ever in doubt, if you're ever thinking to yourself, I wonder if I should document that. If you ever ask yourself that question, the answer is yes. Matter of fact, even if you're thinking to yourself, I probably don't have to document it. If you even have that hint of a thought that, yeah, maybe, no, I don't have to. Hey, that little hint that you said, yeah, maybe, boom, do it. Document it. It's always better to over-document than to under-document. Now here is a list of some of the things that I would include right off the bat in my documentation. I would document all my hardware, all my software, the network topology, my wiring layouts, server configurations, network services, and things like domain controllers and DNS servers and DHCP servers and things like that. And then network procedures, which actually we're going to get into network procedures near the end of this video. So, what are some of the specific items on our list here? Well, how about wiring schematics? Wiring schematics become increasingly important as a network grows. See, if you're working with a very small network, and quite frankly, the diagram I have on the screen is an example of a very small network. Well, the wiring schematics, not nearly as important, because if it's a small network, well, you kind of know where everything is. But as a network grows into a large enterprise environment, it's extremely important to know where all of your cables are running. And I will also tell you that even though the importance might grow as the network grows, it's always a good idea to start from the beginning. Even if you're on a small network, go ahead and start documenting it. Start the wiring schematic, and then as the network grows, you can modify and add to that documentation. Now, these schematics need to be complex enough to thoroughly explain the entire network. Okay, in other words, you're going to have to, and I shouldn't even say complex enough. Really, I would say detailed enough to thoroughly explain the entire network and all aspects of all cabling. While at the same time, it needs to be simple enough for even a new administrator to understand. You want somebody who has a general understanding of network technologies to be able to walk in and take a look at a diagram and know what they're looking at. And one of the ways that we can simplify a very complex or very detailed diagram is with color coding. So as you can see on this particular diagram, all of these RJ45 Ethernet cables, here, 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 and believe it or not, even here, well, they're all blue to represent that they're all RJ45 Ethernet cables. Whereas the red one right here is an RJ45 crossover cable. There's kind of a light gray one representing RJ11, and then black for microfiber. So there's different colors representing different types of cable, and that way, as this network grows, rather than having to have too much labeling all over the place, we can just color code it, and then we would know what type of cable it is. Now, another way this could be done would be possibly by creating a table, a reference table. Maybe you go ahead and create a chart that goes along with this diagram that says blue means this, red means that, gray means this, black means that. Okay, so there are many different ways to establish what the different colors, sometimes it'll be different thicknesses, sometimes it'll be different patterns, what they all represent. Now, another thing that's very important is that you really want to know as much detail as possible about the different cables. So as a for instance, if any of these cables in this particular diagram are running through a plenum, right? Maybe they're up in the false ceiling, maybe they're down under the floor, who knows? This particular diagram doesn't show that. Well, that would be another good idea to put in as part of your wiring schematic. And again, can very easily be done by adding a reference chart to the wiring schematic. Alright, next we have our physical and logical network diagrams. Wow, is this a busy thing that we're looking at right here or what? Well, believe it or not, this busy diagram that we're looking at on the screen right now is an example of a diagram that I had at one point about the network that I was working in here at Train Signal. Now, I will tell you that I have changed certain things and left out certain things for security reasons. But outside of that, I just want to show you that this is a diagram that really kind of shows us both the physical and the logical layout of our network. From a logical point of view, well, you can kind of see how we have our different logical subnets. In other words, right here you can see, I know it's kind of small, but we have our 192.168.13 network. And then up here, here's my office. You can see we have the 192.168.10 network, and then we have Coach's office with a different network, and we got Bill's network. So we logically can see the different networks, and then we can also see what computers are participating on those networks. And to go a step further, some of our significant servers and or network devices, we have the actual IP address of those individual devices. So that's kind of how this represents the logical layout of our network. But how about the physical layout of our network? Well, you may recall from an earlier video, we talked about physical network topologies. We talked about bus and star and ring and mesh. Well, this is showing us physically how things are laid out, in the sense that, as a for instance, On the 192.168.13.0 network, which here we have our switch, and our switch you can see is connected to a device there, and a device there, and a device there, etc., etc. I'm not going to draw an arrow to every device, but I think you get the idea of where I'm going. How are we connected? So what does it look like I'm forming? Yeah, I'm forming a star. And to be more specific, one of the branches off of this particular switch is the switch in my office, which again, you can see, is then creating another star. So we can see that we have a bunch of star topologies. Now, even beyond whether we're talking about star or ring or bus topologies, we can also see physically, well, all right, we've got the internet, and the internet comes in and connects to our cable modem, right? And our cable modem then goes to a router, which then connects us into our main switch, which then connects us off to 1, 2, 3 other switches, and technically it actually connects us to a 4th switch, which is located in the other office. So it's showing us that we are also connected to another office. And to be more detailed, I might have a larger diagram that includes the entire WAN topology, whereas here we're just looking at the LAN topology. Okay, so I can really see a lot about my network and how it's set up, and if somebody is having a problem, or if we need to make some changes, well, this is a great reference point for me to be able to know how things are to then make those changes or help troubleshoot the problem. All right, next we have baselines. And I will tell you that baselines is something that, well, we really should have probably talked about in the network performance optimization video, because really that's what baselines have to do with. Baseline readings are an integral part of maintaining optimal network performance. Now, what does this mean? What are these baseline readings? Well, these are performance readings that are typically taken when the network is in its early stages and or functioning normally. Okay, in other words, it's a bunch of performance readings of, hey, everything's perfect right now, or it's the way it should be right now. Let's just go ahead and take a bunch of readings and see how things are performing. And the reason that we do this is so that when there's a performance problem on the network, right, people are complaining the network's slow. Well, you can take new performance readings and then compare them against the original baseline readings. But guess what? You can't compare against the original baseline readings if you don't have them well documented. And that's where we come back to how this relates to documentation. It's not so much that I'm here to talk to you right now about taking baseline readings as much as documenting them so that you can then compare against them when you have a problem. Now, another really good idea is that new baseline readings can be taken periodically, right? Just over a regularly scheduled period of time. And then you can compare them against each other and help recognize trends in the changes in network performance. That can help you preemptively troubleshoot a potential problem down the road. If every month we take these readings and we notice that every month one area of performance is getting a certain percentage worse, well, then eventually it's going to get to a point that it's not bearable and it will need to be dealt with. But again, unless we're keeping good documentation so we have something to compare against, all of this is just a big waste of time. All right, so here we get into network policies. Network policies are used to establish rules and guidelines regarding network usage and conduct. Now, this is the overall foundation of how people are supposed to act when it comes to your network. But one big mistake that a lot of companies make is that they establish these rules and guidelines, and then they're in place, and a decade goes by, or 2 decades go by, or 3 decades go by, and the world has completely changed. The technology world has changed, the network has changed, the whole business atmosphere has changed, but yet they have all these same policies. And guess what? Those policies get ignored. And by those policies being ignored, they're pointless. You might as well not even have them. So it's very important to review and modify all network policies. And I have here, it says as network and business needs change, but really it's something that should be done on a regularly scheduled basis on top of during a significant change. Okay, it's really important that maybe annually you stop and take a look and say, well, do these policies make sense to what we have going on right now and what our needs are right now? Now, some examples of these policies are network usage policy, and this has to do with what your users can and cannot do on the network. And I'll tell you what, in this policy, not only does it say what the users can and cannot do, but it also should establish what the potential consequences are if the policy is not followed, and it should also establish how those consequences are carried out. And that's another big mistake that a lot of companies make. A lot of companies have policies in place, and they make sense. But then what happens is a little favoritism is shown, whereas some people have to follow the policy and other people don't. Well, that creates a couple of issues. One, as soon as you allow one person to break the rules, that will eventually bleed into 2 people breaking the rules, and then 4 people breaking the rules, and little by little, everybody's breaking the rules. Okay, it's one of those where somebody breaks the rules and then you don't discipline them, you don't follow the policy and the consequences that are supposed to be carried out, and then a second person does it, and you say, well, you know, you let that other person get away with it. And you see where I'm going with this? So it's very important that you have a policy that's well written, that makes sense, and that the consequences and procedures for following those consequences or for laying out those consequences all are fair and sensible. Now we also have our internet and email usage policy. This is probably the most familiar policy that you will see out there. Almost any and every user who works in a company where they even touch a computer has an internet and email usage policy. And these are the policies that establish what users can and cannot do on the internet and or through email. These are the policies that say you can't use them for personal use, you can't do this, you can't do that. And again, here's a typical line out of a typical policy. Failure to comply can lead to disciplinary action up to and including termination. Ever seen that line before? I'm telling you, some attorney wrote that line sometime many years ago and is probably getting royalties off of it because it appears in almost every single usage policy. And then another one I have listed here would be an external software policy. So policies regarding any external software that is brought into the company as far as how it can be done. Is there certain software that can be downloaded off the internet? Is there software that can be brought in on CDs and DVDs? Or if you want to go back far enough, floppy disks? And what needs to take place if you want to install that software? So these are just some examples of network policies that you're going to want to have in place on your network. Now that leads us into network procedures. And I've already used the term procedure just a few moments ago when I was talking about policies and I was talking about carrying the procedures to carry out disciplinary action or in consequences. Well, network procedures are used to establish how specific networking tasks are to be performed. So very often the networking procedures will reside within our network policies. Now there are many procedures that a network administrator is responsible for doing. So having very good documentation of these procedures will help guide an administrator in appropriately managing the network. Now, not all procedures are about consequences and disciplinary action. Some procedures have to do with basic things like backing up the network. How often is it to be done? Do we need to change out the tapes? Do we need to take the tapes off site? How often do we want to run performance baselines? What areas of performance do we want to gather baseline readings on? How often do we want to check our hardware, like our servers, and make sure that you put it through various checks to make sure that it's still in good working status. Or how about a UPS, a backup battery? Checking it to make sure that it's going to function and it'll work in the event of a power failure. So there are many different things that an administrator needs to do, and it's a lot easier if you have it well documented so that you don't have to memorize everything. Now, as far as network configuration goes, here's the bottom line. We've talked about having wiring schematics, physical and logical network diagrams, but on top of all that, it's also a good idea to have detailed configuration documentation of all of your significant networking devices. So whether it be routers and switches, or possibly even servers and how they're configured. If you don't have it documented, then every single time you walk up to that device, you're trying to remember. Now, how did I set this up again? And I'll tell you what, it's the most common thing in the world. I've done it a million times. And no matter how often I do it, no matter how often I'm kicking myself saying, man, I wish I would have had that written down somewhere so I didn't have to try to remember what it was that I did. Or maybe I feel like kicking someone else because they come up to me and they say, hey Ed, you helped me with this once before. Do you remember what we did? Well, did you document it? Doesn't matter how many times I kick myself over this, it doesn't seem to make me want to document anymore. But it should. And it should make you want to do it more. Bump up documentation on your to-do list. I know you've heard me say that way too many times, but it's really that important. Now, the last thing we have here is something called regulations. And I will tell you that regulations are a lot like policies. Regulations are in place to establish rules and guidelines. But here's the difference. Policies are created within an organization and by the people of the organization, whereas regulations are the actual legalities and laws that are created by the government. And along with those regulations have actual legal consequences that go with them. And although it's plenty important to follow company policies, it's that much more important to follow the law. So just keep that in mind. Policies are more company-based, regulations are government-based, or legal regulations. And that brings us to the end of the video, and at this point you should be able to, well, I really hope you can explain the importance of having good documentation. I think I've beaten that into you enough throughout this video. You should be able to recognize and understand wiring schematics, physical and logical network diagrams. Describe the purpose of using baselines. You should be able to create good, sensible network policies, procedures, and configuration documentation, and understand the importance of following legal regulations. All right, that's it. I will see you in the next video.